it's about learning how you can do that in your own way, is actually give those little pieces of feedback and embrace the uncomfortable, embrace the awkward moment where you give someone some direct feedback. Know it's going to be uncomfortable, but remember, every time you do it, remember, this is uncomfortable, yes, but it's like a 1 out of 10 uncomfortable. And I know I'm doing this to save myself from the 11 out of 10 horror show. If I don't do this and a year from now, it all blows up.
Hey everyone, Tamara here for another great episode of With Tamara Gondor. That's me. Super excited that you are joining us today, whether that's on any of the podcast stations, audio, on our YouTube channel, on our website. This is the place to be for you to be an everyday innovator. Ignite innovation, influence others, and make an impact. I'm excited for today's conversation because our guest has some really incredible insights around, get this ready, something we all deal with all the time, managing difficult people. I love it. I love this conversation. I was so excited when I got his book, Step Up or Step Out, How to Deal with Difficult People. So we're going to dig into that. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Jonno White is the founder of Clarity. It's a consultancy based in Brisbane, Australia, and it exists to fill the world with healthy organizations. And what I love about him is when he says fill the world with healthy organizations, like me, he really comes from a people perspective. Like, how do we get people to tap their potential? How do we get people to interact in a healthy and positive way that moves everybody forward? So the conversation we're about to have in order to do that is all about dealing with difficult people. We talk about the 4 ingredients of the recipe for disaster. We talk about how to manage not just difficult people if you're the leader managing down, but if you're kind of that mid-level managing up, or even across a dotted line to someone who has more power, more say or hierarchy. So we tackle it from a lot of different places, and he shares some stories that I think are going to relate to all of you. This is a good one. Before I dig in, let me share with you something that I'm super keen on right now because it helps me stay hydrated. And while that might sound out in left field to you, I think you know that in order to do what we do, to be everyday innovators, to bring our best, to play at a peak performance level, to create a problem solve, do all those things, we got to have a healthy body too. And part of that is staying hydrated. So my favorite thing right now for that is the Hydromate water bottle. So my water bottle is a half gallon. Here's what I love about it. On the side, it has these great things. So it's like 8 a.m., ready, set, drink. At 12 p.m., it has keep drinking. 4 p.m. says no excuses. If you're seeing on video, you can see it. You get the point. I love the Hydromate because it allows me to have a large body of water on my desk that I can go through all day long. Because I don't know about you, but for me, the sticking point is going to fill up a small water bottle. I never do it. So I get like 1 water bottle in. But there's something with this that really works for me. Hydromate. I love it. It's like the best water bottle out there. Go get one. We'll put the link in the show notes. All right, let's get to dealing with difficult people. Okay, I'm super excited for today. Jonno, thank you so much for joining me. As we were kind of talking before we officially hit record, I'm excited for today's conversation. Your book is phenomenal, which we'll kind of dig into. And I think that it covers a topic that most of us try to avoid, but in avoiding make worse, which is about like conflict and debate and difficult people. So I'm excited to dig into this and give our audience some real tools to help them move forward. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Tamara. I'm really excited to chat about conflict and dealing with difficult people.
I can't wait. So I want to actually start with your why, because I thought this was kind of interesting. So when I read your book, kind of the opening of it, you wrote, investing in people to become everything they're meant to be in order to fill the world with healthy organizations that people love to work at and that make a significant positive difference to their communities, nations, and across the world. So I want to know why that and kind of this area of difficult people and conflict in the workplace, why that matters to you so much that you would focus your effort there, write a whole book on it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It took me 3 or 4 years to actually articulate my why like that, because I went on that journey and Simon Sinek's book Start With Why was a big part of that. But I just remember having a few goes at this, and the hard thing for me is that this is one of the things I often do with organizations or with other entrepreneurs, but it's very hard to actually do that process with yourself. But I do admit I do consult to myself every now and then, rather unsuccessfully, and it's a bit nerdy. I will go to a coffee shop and try to play both roles. And so it took me probably longer than it would if I was in the consultant shoes. But I just remember having a day where I was revisiting it, and I was looking at everything I'd been focusing on, but had been at a higher level. Like I'd really been thinking organizational structures. I'm so interested in how organizations are wired, and strategy. I'm so interested in that. But I remember having this epiphany and going, no, at the end of the day, really what drives me is the people in an organization, because it's the people that are turning up to work, so that if I work with a leader, whether it's an entrepreneur and a small business, or whether it's a leader with a really large organization, I just had this revelation that really what drives me at the deepest level is knowing that whatever we do, whatever change we make, in that small business or in that large organization, it's actually the people whose lives are made better. And probably my deep frustration is the idea of people turning up to work and feeling limited and feeling like, oh, I wish I could work somewhere or volunteer somewhere where I could fulfill my potential. And so when I realized that, it was like, that's what it is. That's what at the deepest level drives me, is that if people can turn up to work and really fulfill their potential, that's at the deepest level. And so even though that outworks in lots of different ways, and that's probably where this book comes out of too, because really I coached leader after leader after leader after leader. I'm always looking for patterns, and sometimes you imagine them, sometimes you think maybe that's there, and then it's not. But something that never went away was 50%, 1 in 2 of my coaching sessions, as I tried to help leaders, this topic came up. And so the book really wrote itself in some ways, because I just had leaders sitting with me or on the phone with me, and we're just trying to work out, how can you do it? How can we be healthier with doing conflict, particularly when there's someone on our team or a colleague and we're finding them really difficult? And what do we do? And so I just found that 50% of sessions came back to that. And and so if I could help leaders with that, I knew I was going to help make a difference for them, but also the people they lead.
So there's a couple of things I just want to pull out what you're saying that I think are really important for us to just hear. One is, and I was guilty of this for a long time in the innovation space, is we look for these like culture, initiatives, structure, solutions to what really are human challenges and opportunities. And so our work is all focused on how you innovate as a human, not what is an initiative you could follow. And
yes,
you're saying really resonated with me after reading your book is, and we'll put the link to the book in the show notes, of course, is that it was about one-on-one or team interaction at the person level and not at the initiative level. And I think that's oftentimes why these things fails, because we go too big, too high when it's really just us as people getting together. And so that's one thing that really stood out for me. The second one is, we spend, I don't know what % of time at work in our lives. And so that work should be meaningful and amazing, I think. And it's hard to do that, to your point, if you feel limited. So I guess the next question I actually want to ask you before we dig into the rest of it is, why is that the case? Why do so many people feel so limited when they walk through those doors of work, or virtual doors now?
Yeah, that's it's such an interesting question, and I think if you could find a really succinct answer, I think I'm still searching for the key to really articulate that in some ways, because maybe there's another book in that, because it is such a big question, isn't it? And if you just think of your own life, I don't know about you, but for me, I just know so many people who are such wonderful, kind, competent, hardworking people who are stuck in, and I think it comes back to me to the systems. And I think the problem is that we build systems, and so sort of one of two things happens when you have a small business. You really are relying on the interpersonal, the interpersonal skills of the leader. They are the system. So if you've got a team of 4 around you, the advantage is you can all get in the room and work together. The disadvantage is that if like your whole world is shaped by really how the leader of that, if you're not the leader of the business, how the leader of that business leads you, that very much shapes your world. But then we grow and we get into these bigger organizations, and man, there's something broken with our systems. I just find, actually, there's this phrase that keeps coming out that will probably be a future book that I'll write, which, coming back to this, probably answers your question as best as I can. It's this idea of invest in people. I think as organizations, particularly when we get large, when we get bureaucratic, if there's this lack of seeing people for the role they have in an organization, but also, and it sounds a bit strange, but I love this idea of new venture capitalism, where it's like, actually the ultimate venture capitalism isn't an idea. It isn't some cryptocurrency. It's actually about a shift in mindset to invest in your people. And if leaders can get this and actually see someone who comes in their organization and work all their systems around how do we invest in that person, I think that would change everything. But that's a big idea. So to answer your question, I think it's broken systems in large organizations that don't invest in people, that put people, that whole square peg in a round hole. It's just, that's the path you have to be on for 10 years to move to the next level, when people are actually designed to go and do this, but there's no real way for that to happen.
No, I probably shouldn't be admitting this because some of these people are probably listening, but I have to tell you, what you're saying really resonates, partially because I remember when I was new to the business world. And so I was in innovation and brand strategy consulting. So we'd go into these big Fortune 500 companies and help them develop new products, new services. I loved it. Like that space really lights me up. It's so fun to imagine kind of what could come next. But I also sometimes would remember being in a room with all the VPs. Now I'm in my 20s, so I'm expecting brilliance from everybody. Like, my God, these guys have all made it. So obviously they're the best of the best. And some of them were, like, without a doubt. But some of them fit exactly what you were just saying. They checked off the boxes of the structure that they were in. So they got to the VP level, but they offered nothing. And I remember being a little bit surprised at how many people fit that and didn't fit what I expected from everybody. And again, there were some absolute brilliance and people who I just totally admire. But I was always shocked at how many didn't fit that.
Yeah.
All right, so
I think
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I agree, and I think it's if particularly leaders in those rooms, if they just had that shift of thinking about okay, what does it look like, and just to say as well, one of the things I hear from leaders in those rooms, one of the main challenges, top 5 challenges that probably goes with dealing with difficult people. But one of the other really big challenges is, how do I find and keep great staff? And I come back to this all the time where I'm like, well, your organization, if you want to find and keep great staff, all you've got to do, I'm not saying it's easy, it's simple. But as Patrick Lencioni says, I love this quote about building teams, but it really works for anything in the business world, in my opinion. It's both possible and remarkably simple, but painfully difficult. And the painfully difficult part is to shift your organization to actually go, how do we attract amazing people by making our whole organization about asking the question, how can we bring you in and fulfill your potential? If we could do that, you would stay. And then even if you do leave, we'd be attracting so many, because that's like a moth to a flame. When I hear an organization that's doing that, even I think that's somewhere I want to work. Because they get it. They get that I'm not just a cog in a wheel. I'm a person with potential. If you can tap into that, you've really tapped into something that gives incredible loyalty and fulfillment.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think when I look at teams that do really well, part of why they do well is their leader really recognizes the potential in room and serves that. So, we talk about servant leadership, leading from behind. I get a little frustrated with that stuff, because I actually think, to your point, it's more about potential leadership. Like, how do I not just pull out the task and the job from this person, but how do I actually tap all that they have to offer inside of them? And frankly, as a leader, and I have a small business, but why would I only want to pay that person for 50% of their potential? Like, I want all of it. So I've never gotten that. So let's dig in, because you have so many great nuggets in your book, and I want to start with what you call, well, I'm gonna put my glasses through it, what you call the recipe for disaster, because to me that gets to the heart of conflict, and I think if left, festers, right, and gets worse. So will you break down the recipe for disaster for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the recipe for disaster, I came across this recipe, just to give you the context before I just give you the bullet points. I came across this recipe when working with I'd sort of seen it, but it stood out to me most clearly when I worked with a client over in the UK. And I remember just working with them and talking through a sort of situation that had blown up previously over the past couple of years. And so I was just interested to know what happened. And as we sort of got into the discussion, and they explained, well, I had this person on my team, and there was, from day one, there was a little bit of, we sort of missed each other. Like we didn't quite glue, we didn't gel straight away. And, but it was okay. I just, there were some things that frustrated me, but I was so busy with leading the organization and leading the team, and they were on the exec team this person was leading, that we just kept on keeping on. It was fine, until it wasn't.
Well,
and then it was like,
well, it is not.
And it was like, I could walk past these things, but there was just, there was this one particular season where a few things happened, and they hit the non-negotiable sort of territory, where this leader was saying, so what I did is I just realized, you know what, I have to go there and confront this person and have this conversation. And so they went in and they organized a meeting. They sat down. They felt really confident because they, from their perspective and talking with them, and this is often the intention of leaders in this space, they did actually want the best for this person. They found them a bit frustrating. So that's where they probably did find them a bit difficult to work with. But they walked in going, I really do want the best for them. And I probably just haven't done the best job in actually going there. And now I'm going to really go there and help them. But they also sat down and brought in HR and jumped into how can we help you performance management plan, thinking that it would come across as, let's help you get better, and assuming that they could see all the things that they saw. And lo and behold, it absolutely blew up in their face. This meeting was just that nightmare meeting where it started off great, but as soon as it was a bit uncomfortable, and as soon as the words performance management plan came out, and they started chatting about just, really helping them grow, and all these words that as a leader, they thought, I just assumed they would get it. They just got super defensive, and it just got more and more aggressive in an unhelpful way. I just felt like they were going further and further apart. And they were just expressing how confused they were and how they felt like they were just chasing ground, trying to claw it back, and feeling like it was just getting out of hand. And this thing that to them, it hadn't been the biggest thing. They'd known they needed to go there, but overall, this person had actually been quite competent. So for them, it was just one part of their job that they wanted to address, and it felt like it just blew up into this massive thing. The meeting finished. They then had some meetings afterwards where they tried to claw it back, but this person left, which to them in that situation hadn't actually been, they had been looking at that person knowing that they filled a great role, and it was just these. So that hadn't been their intention. It actually was a massive loss for everyone involved, because it was just horrible and a great and a terrible finish to that relationship. And it just, that whole area of the organization was stunted for a while, because that, those couple of months where they ended up then leaving were just, nothing really helpful was getting done. It was all defensive. And so when I was talking to them, they were just scratching their head going, I just don't know what went wrong. Like, I felt like I was doing the right thing. I felt like I had gone, actually, I need to confront this, but it made it worse. And so the recipe for disaster, when I heard that, it really helped clarify some things. And the first thing, when I delved into it with the leader and we were just reflecting on it together, the first thing is unclear expectations.
So that's
that's the first ingredient in the recipe for disaster. And I was chatting with them about this, and this comes up all the time with leaders, is, how clear your expectations are, and how painful your conflict is. They're going to be incredibly connected. So if you have unclear expectations, then expect any conflict that you're dealing with a person to be very painful and challenging. But every single step you can take to clarify expectations will decrease the pain of conflict. Now, there's always some pain in conflict. There's always uncomfortable. That's what makes conflict. The idea of a painless conflict is actually, not realistic at all.
You're probably shoving it under the rug for later conflict. Hey, can I ask you a question on unclear expectations before you go on to the three? So I was actually really excited to bring this up because this was a conversation I just had with a very good friend of mine who heads up a subdivision of a company. And she was telling me that they're having a hard time hiring. And she said, we hired a few people and we thought they got it. And then like 3 months into the job, they felt like we did a bait and switch on them in terms of what the expectations were of the job. And we felt like we were clear from the beginning. And I was saying to her on a personal level, it's interesting. I learned this technique with my kids and I actually do it with my team. I said, I often find like if I get mad at my kids for something and I'm yelling at them because I do, and I said I don't. And then like you go, do you get it? And they go, yeah. And then I walk away and 2 days later, they're doing the same thing because it turns out they didn't get what I said. So I've learned to have them actually share back with me how they're perceiving what I'm saying. And I actually do it with my team, not about conflict necessarily, but just about like, hey, this is the job that needs to get done. And then I have them articulate it to me. So I was talking with this Patty, and we're talking about expectations and how they're really having a hard time making sure people are on the same page of expectations. And it got me thinking that this is actually a really important one. And I'm glad it's number one, because I think oftentimes people nod their heads. Either they want to get along and go along, or they think they get it, but through their filters, it becomes something else. How do you really make sure that people are on the same page and the expectations are in alignment versus head nodding? Because I think so many people do that.
Yeah, how do you make sure they're actually clear and not just head nodding? I would say it comes down to this idea of ridiculously clear expectations. Like it's about, once you realize how important this is, you've got to double down and triple down on it and really, like go over the top. It's almost like, and as well, I always say you can't pick everything. So there'll always be things. I was in a seminar the other day sort of presenting this, and someone asked a great question, and it was, but aren't there always going to be things that you run into that sort of, you can't just articulate everything at the start? And I was like, yeah, clarifying expectations is about doing everything you can at the start. And then the whole point of the framework that I go through in the book is this, which I'll get to, is this idea of picking small battles. But before you pick any small battles, there's those small clarifications that happen in the day-to-day. But I think that the key to clarifying expectations, I think it really comes back to what you said about listening. And I love how you said that, because one of my favorite phrases, I don't remember where I heard it, but I love this phrase, which is people don't feel heard when you understand them. People feel heard when they understand that you understand them. And so it's like a riddle, but it's like, if you want your people to feel heard, if you want to actually through this process for them to actually have the penny to drop around expectations, then it's not just you understanding them. And so what I do with leaders to make this practical, and this is something anyone listening can do as well, is to give yourself a score out of 10 for how clear you think you are on your expectations for this person. And this is always a fun exercise, because scoring something out of 10.
I think I am.
Yeah. And you'd think a lot of us would be like, 9 or 10. And sometimes they are. But when I do this with leaders and we sit in a room, and particularly when we're talking about someone specifically that they're finding challenging, they'll often when they really stop and think about it and spend 30 seconds going, how clear am I? If 10 out of 10 is I'm 100% clear on what my expectations are for them. Sometimes, like often the score will be a 5 or a 6 out of 10, which is just shows that gap between all the assumptions that we fill in. And then the next question I ask is, okay, well, how clear, if you had to give a score out of 10, how clear is this person, the difficult person that you're trying to deal with? How clear do you think they are about what your expectations are out of 10? And it's a confronting question, because suddenly it's not just about me and what my expectations are, but it's about how well they're getting them and how well they've actually grasped them. And The other day I had a leader and their score was 5 and 2, 5 out of 10 for them, 2 out of 10 for the person. And the beauty of that, there's good news. Well, it's bad, right? But the good news is that that's what they can fix. You can fix that and get them up to an 8, 9, or 10. It's beautiful.
There's two things that you said kind of quickly that I just want to highlight because I think they're so important. Kind of earlier when we were talking about this, you said about you can't have everything, so prioritize the things that matter. I think that's a big insight for all of us to pay attention to is, I think I fall into this trap. I want them to get everything all the time, 100%. And that's an unfair expectation. And you're right. I should prioritize, like, here are the top 5 things that really matter that I get, that we are on the same page about. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And I love, so I just wanted to take a second to recognize that, because I think that's part of the reason why we become unclear is because it all gets muddied together.
Yes.
And the other thing I love that you said, I just want to take a moment and make sure we recognize is about, and I'm going to botch it up now, but people feel heard when they know you heard them. However you said that, I know that you know that you know that I know. But when my team
that's right.
says back to me what I said in a way that makes me realize they get it, like that's when I feel comfortable. I feel happy. I feel heard. I don't feel that when I just push it onto them. So I think that that's a really important thing. Okay, I know I derailed this a little bit because there's 3 other parts of the recipe that I want to make sure to get to. The expectations to me, like when you and I were going to have this conversation, and I had this other conversation, and I just felt like it all came together, and that expectations are it's a miss out of the gate. And that like derails everything else. And then people turn difficult. So, okay, so the other 3, what are the other 3?
Yeah, so one is unclear expectations, and then the second one is what we do is, and I love how much I can identify with this. As soon as I go to say it, I think of all the times I've done this. So it'll probably be the same for everyone listening. But there's something in us that avoids the little battles because, for legitimate reasons, we're so busy. We see that thing and we think, you know what, it's minor. I can let it go. And as a result, what ends up happening is we end up in one-off big battles. So that's the second ingredient. Not only do we start with unclear expectations, but then we find ourselves in what I call a one-off big battle, which leads to the third ingredient. And it creates the third ingredient for the recipe disaster, which is surprise. And surprise... And there's this myth going around, I've been into this in the past as well, but it's like, don't have a hallway conversation, book a meeting and go there properly, which sounds right. It sounds like wisdom, but the problem is that for people in 2021 with everything on our plate, sometimes the next available time for you to meet is a week and a half.
Yes.
So what ends up happening is with all the best intentions of not wanting to derail someone by having a little prize, which catches them completely unawares. People feel ambushed, and this is why this recipe for disaster is why these meetings go so badly, and why afterwards we often reflect and go, "Gee, I thought that was the right thing to do, but I feel like I might have just made it worse." And the fourth ingredient is what I call the secret ingredient. And it's really why this book's not called Step Up or Step Out, How to Deal with People. It's called Step Up or Step Out, How to Deal with Difficult People, even if you hate conflict. And it really got me thinking. And people have asked me before about this idea of difficult people. And I was thinking, why are difficult people so difficult? And there's a fantastic counselor in Australia, a guy named Peter Janetsky, who does excellent work in this sort of space. And it was chatting with him when he gave me this aha moment. So I really have to honor him for this, which is in common. And that is they have unrealistic expectations. And that for me was such a revelation, because I went, oh, if I think of anyone that I've ever found like really difficult, not just there's a miscommunication, but it's like everything I do feels like it gets translated into another language and they completely miss it or ignore it. It's this idea of unrealistic expectations. And so the recipe for disaster, so that's the fourth ingredient, it's sort of bookended by expectations. We start with unclear expectations, And then if you've got someone really difficult, often they are living their life day after day after day with unrealistic expectations. And that means that if you go back to clarifying expectations, your job got a lot harder. Suddenly it's actually going to be even harder to get really clear, because you might be dealing with someone who actually goes through their day-to-day because of a lot of things, family of origin, people get triggered by different things. And so you might be dealing with someone who at the best of times, even if you get to a 10 out of 10, getting them above a 7, 8, 9 out of 10 is going to be very, very challenging.
So I just want to summarize and break it down for a minute, because there's so much goodness in here. So the 4 recipe for disasters: unclear expectations, one-off battles, surprise, and then unrealistic expectations. How does that show up in a day-to-day world? If I'm on a team and I'm over here thinking, I've got a little bit of conflict. And I often find that, so oftentimes when we go and do work with teams, our focus is innovation, but oftentimes it's about creating high-performing teams. And oftentimes there's an unsaid conflict that people just sit in. They just deal with it. And then we come in and all the shit comes out, and then they get to a better place. Because I think you got to get it out too. So just walk me through an example of how all this might show up for someone. If I'm listening and I'm going, oh, I have a recipe for disaster on my hands, what are the things I should look for?
And are you thinking about someone listening who's in the role of leader or in the role of employee?
So that's a great question back. And I would ask then to you for both, because I do think that you have different abilities depending on your role.
Yeah, that's right. And it is, and one of the questions that comes up a lot is, what do you do when you're leading up to someone who's a difficult person?
Well, let's start with the leader. Let's go to that other side, because I do think that matters.
Yeah. So as a leader, so the way this usually comes up is, I think we live ignorant of it, or it doesn't get on our radar until we hit the one-off big battle point most of the time. And I think it sounds like that's what you do. You walk into a team and you help to articulate, identify, and get out some of the things that people have just lived with and gone, too hard, basket. I don't know how I would, because it's not a deal breaker. It's not a non-negotiable. It's just little things. And so I think in the day-to-day, when you're a leader, the biggest thing that comes out, so in terms of the day-to-day, is it's usually about behaviors. It's not so much about ideas or issues when it comes to conflict, right? It's about how people are behaving. So let's go with a really simple example. Is you might have a team member who is, if you're in a physical workspace, or let's say you're in a virtual workspace, they just turn up late to a lot of things. They're a bit tardy on deadlines, and we just live with that frustration, which is a really everyday thing I work with leaders around, and they're going, this person, they just don't get it. And so what happens is they're a bit late here, a bit late there. We mention it now and then, but not always. And then they miss an important deadline, or we've got that project that comes up that's like, we can't. I've had pressure from my boss on this, where it's like, this matters, and now I have to deal with this person. And so that's where we end up in the one-off big battle, where we assume that those couple of things we've mentioned in passing about them being a bit late on things is they're going to completely be ready for a conversation about how they've been underperforming for 2 years. And honestly, because we just assume as leaders, we're like, they must realize how frustrating that is for me and for the company. And so I think we usually end up in that space of one-off big battle. So how this normally happens, I often find that leaders usually, I'm most often working with leaders when they're getting to a one-off big battle point. That's when they reach out to me and go, okay, can you just confirm for me that this is the right course of action? I go, whoa, let's take a step back. So for your listeners, if you're in a leader position, it's about stopping and going, okay, I may not be at the one-off big battle point yet. So maybe what are those little behaviors from my team? And say it's the tardiness and being late. Have you actually articulated that to that person crystal clear? Have you had a conversation about and we assume these things, but that's where you might need to be really clear about that. in actually having that conversation.
Passive, right? You don't mean to, but you accidentally turn passive aggressive when you're like, thanks for joining us 10 minutes late, Jonno. Let me catch you. What's happening. Yeah.
And that's where so in the book I talk about this sort of this process for dealing well with difficult people, which starts with clarifying the expectations. And the second one is to have a crucial conversation. And so in terms of how this works day to day, and this is probably one of the big takeaways. I don't know how much I emphasize this in the book, but as I work with people around the book more and more, this is probably one of the big takeaways for those people listening is or watching is to think to yourself, okay, when might you need to have a difficult conversation or a crucial conversation? Like we'd like to ignore the fact that we'll probably have to have one at some point. And often they're the one-off big battle conversations where we go, okay, now I've got to deal with this because something's happened that's blown up. I love encouraging leaders and saying, guess what? You do have to have a difficult conversation or a crucial conversation, but you can have that. You can switch that up if you're willing to be courageous and actually go in and have your crucial conversation now to talk about expectations. Don't let it get to a one-off big battle. And so I talk with leaders around going and sitting down with their people. If you've got someone where you're really struggling to manage them, then have a conversation where you sit down with them and actually, instead of waiting for the one-off big battle, where the conversation isn't about performance management, it's not about 2 years of underperforming. It's about, this is difficult right now. It's not at a big one-off battle point. So why don't I go in and actually have a crucial conversation, but about expectations? And part of that conversation is about looking at someone and saying, how clear do you feel you are on my expectations? Yeah. And the beauty of that is nothing's blown up yet. You can be really authentic and vulnerable. And as a leader, this is what I encourage leaders to do, is to walk into the conversation and say, you know what, I'm sorry, I'm growing as a leader. And one of the things I've been reflecting on recently, even saying something like, I heard a podcast with Tamara, and for me as a leader, it helped me think, I wonder how clear my expectations are for my people. And you know what, I don't know how well I've necessarily done that. And so I thought I'd just bring it up and say, I really want to be the sort of leader who gives you super clear expectations, because I think it makes your life easier. And then ask and say, how are you finding? Like, do you feel like my expectations are really clear? And then stop and pause. And that's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But that's a million times better than the recipe for disaster conversations we end up having with people.
To get to the blow up, you know that there a lot has been festering for a long time. One of the best pieces of feedback I ever got when I was leading at this one company, we did these 360 reviews, I thought, was that people said that they liked working for me because they always knew where they stood in the moment. Like, because I'm pretty direct. So I tell people like what's working, what's not working in the moment. I don't tend to, I think it through and I process it. I'm thoughtful and kind. And I always assume best intent, but I've always been very clear. And I was really proud of that, because I always thought, wow. So, and what I have found, I love your perspective on this, is because I got known for being super direct, is if I came to you with a problem or something I needed you to work on or to improve or to do differently, people knew I came with the best intent and not trying to slam them. Because I do think sometimes with difficult people, that we assume the person telling us what we need to improve is actually like sticking it to us, you know? And that's like this weird thing that comes up when people don't assume best intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and I love that you had that feedback around your style, because that's a gift to have that style, which as we were chatting about before, you were saying before we press record, a little bit of the family of origin of your style conflict, being Israeli. And my wife is Greek, and it's a little bit similar with the Greeks. I remember my mother-in-law has, she'll be having a discussion with my father-in-law, and then she'll stop mid-discussion and turn to me, and they call me Jonathan. They say, Jonathan, we're not fighting. We're just having a conversation, and then go back into it. And I think there's actually a great, that's a real gift to be able to have that style, because you've hit the nail on the head with the fact is that people probably don't always appreciate the direct feedback you're giving them, but because you're doing it in small doses, it's much more palatable, and you can work with that. So if you don't have that style, which as an example I don't, it's about learning how you can do that in your own way, is actually give those little pieces of feedback and embrace the uncomfortable, embrace the awkward moment where you give someone some direct feedback. Know it's going to be uncomfortable, but remember, every time you do it, remember this is uncomfortable, yes, but it's like a 1 out of 10 uncomfortable. And I know I'm doing this to save myself from the 11 out of 10 horror show. If I don't do this and a year from now, it all blows up.
Well, that's the irony of it. The longer we wait, the worse it gets. I have a great question here from the audience. So I want to make sure, let me read it and get it right. So, and it kind of goes to what we were saying about if you're middle or junior on the totem pole versus if you're the leader. So the question is, I have a really difficult person on my team who's not my direct boss, but is technically more senior to me. How do I lead up and over to get them and us to a better place when I'm not their boss and they're not really my boss? Okay, so that's a great question, because I think not only is it from the junior level, but also I think a lot of us work in these dotted line teams now where it's not necessarily a direct up and down. It's a cross-functional team, but you've got hierarchy on the team. So Jonno, what's your advice there?
Well, firstly, I have a lot of sympathy and empathy, because I've been there as well for that position. And so when you have a colleague that's not your direct report that you're finding really difficult, you do have to start by saying, well, first of all, there is an element of being smart, isn't there? Like at the end of the day, it's one thing when you're the leader of a team and you can go there and pick these battles, but you have an element of control over the team. But particularly if you have a toxic work colleague, you might be second guessing yourself, because sometimes they'll even undermine or white ant you if you get on their bad side.
Yeah.
And that's the side of politics that's so hard. So I just acknowledge firstly that that's a really hard situation to be in, and that sometimes we're in those situations and it maybe the starting point is just realizing, actually, this is actually really difficult, and legitimately, it's not that I just need to be better at X, Y, or Z. Right. I'm on a team with a difficult person, and this is really hard. And then, so from there, I would say I would be thinking about clear expectations with my boss, who's the direct report, and how can I get as clear as possible with them? Because the clearer I am on the same page with them, the better it's going to be in terms of this colleague who might be a bit more senior than me. So I would be investing in my relationship with my direct report in terms of leading up. How can I lead up to them as well as possible? Because the more trust I can build with them, not from a political perspective, but I just know that the more I can work, the better I can work with them, it's going to help probably navigate some of this as well. And then when it comes to that person, I think the big phrase that comes to mind is pick small battles.
Yeah.
And when we've got people like that, you do have to pick your battles. You can't go there for everything. And just some really practical advice. And this is where, Tamara, my heart breaks, because this is where the organizational systems, I love the idea of getting rid of politics as much as possible. There's always some element, but so it breaks my heart when someone's going, I'm in a situation where it's quite political in terms of I've got this person who's more senior. But I would be trying to get things in writing. If I get really practical and just like in terms of what would I do if I was in your shoes, and I have been in that sort of position before, is try to pick small battles wherever you can with the person. And if you have a conversation about it, follow it up in writing. Because difficult people remember unrealistic expectations. Things change a couple of months. Now, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They may not have the self-awareness to realize that they've completely shifted what happened 2 months ago. Let's give them that benefit of the doubt. So it's helpful if you do pick a small battle to follow it up with something in writing. And what I mean by that is, when I say pick small battles, is if you're dealing with them and there's things you can overlook and it's not an issue in that with that team, then from a holistic perspective, that's not ideal. But you've got to work out how to live and how to work in a team like that. You probably let that go. But when there's something where you go, oh, okay, this could bite me in the future in terms of this relationship and this relationship with my direct report. Pick the small battle, go there, have the conversation, and be specific about it. Because where you don't want to end up is in a mediation meeting with your direct report, where it's, but over the past year, I've been putting up with blah, blah, blah. So whenever you're dealing with anyone where you're finding it difficult, you want to be specific and avoid generalizations. And so that's why that would be my advice, would be to find specific things and pick battles about those where you need to, and invest in your relationship with the direct report.
It seems to me that if you get to the point where it's an HR issue or a triad conversation, you've waited too long or something's gone. Like it's a little, not past the point, there's always possibility, but I want to ask you a little bit of a different question, because I'm having a weird thought as you're talking. So let me share a story with you, and then kind of parlays into my question. So I had this client once. So I work with bureaus who then have clients, right? And I go speak for those clients through the bureaus. Bureaus are like my agent for keynote speaking. And I had one client through a bureau, and the bureau said to me, "Listen, Tamara, I just want you to know this client is super difficult. They micromanage. They ask a lot of you. They will be on you all the time. Like, for them, it really matters that they look good in this role that they're in and in bringing." So just know that this woman, this client, has not liked anybody. And that was my entrance into this client that I was working with. Now, let me just fast forward for a second. She loves me and I love her. And we had an incredible relationship. I knocked it out of the park for her, and now she's hiring me again. But here, and what I felt about her, funny enough, was that she just expected the best. And I didn't mind the micromanaging, because I don't like generally to be micromanaged. That's why I have my own company and not work for somebody else. But I knew that she was trying to improve whatever I was doing to be the best together. So I assumed intent, but there was I just realized something when you were talking, which is I went into it going, okay, this person's difficult. It's not me. It's not something I'm doing. This is their pattern. And I had just now realize that I really had a sense of ease going into that client, because I just expected her to be difficult. Okay, like she's going to be difficult, right? And it just put me a little bit at ease, because I do think, to what you're saying, sometimes you just have difficult people, right? And you have to deal with it. But what I'm saying, I guess what I'm asking is that part of it, is just knowing, all right, this person on my team is difficult. Does that just help even alleviate the situation, and not being a cop-out for dealing with it or for assuming best intent, but just, I don't know, a little bit of peace of mind of like, you know what, some people are difficult.
Yeah, I think I think that's 100% true. I remember hearing from there's a pastor in the US named Stephen Furtick, who does some stuff in leadership, and he just said this phrase, which I can't remember the context he was saying it, but it really stuck with me, is that you have your expectation, you have your experience, and frustration is the gap in between.
Yes.
And I was just like, that's so true. And I think this is often, if you put it on another angle, because you're talking about a client you're working with, I'll often be working with someone and they've got a really difficult leader. So they're on an executive team and the CEO is really difficult. And we'll have this conversation. And there's often a sense of expectation that, to use a phrase that I mentioned Peter Janetsky, this Australian counsellor, before. He talks about this. There's a sense that we think that we can wake them up. And it's about going, actually, no, the realistic expectation is that I probably can't wake people up. And one of the most confronting things I say to leaders all the time, if you think about that person who might be listening who's got a really difficult leader, is that unfortunately the leader of an organization, or the leader, particularly, let's talk about an organization, the leader of an organization, in my opinion, is the ceiling for, not the ceiling for potential, but is the ceiling for things like vulnerability, the ceiling for trust, will be the ceiling for culture. And so if you have, and so I work with these leaders and they're like, they're so difficult. We're just trying to build this amazing culture. How can I do it? What do you think? Like, what's the silver bullet? And the confronting thing to have to say is, well, if the leader has a ceiling here and you're talking about a culture of an organization here, it's probably not going to happen while they're the leader.
Mm.
And that's very sobering. But it's just, and so that often leads people to think, well, maybe is this the right place for me to be? And that's because who is leading you is so important. And so if you're in a place where you have someone that's difficult, then I think being realistic about that, like you said, and walking into that knowing my expectation of how difficult this is going to be is here. So if my experience is there, then my frustration is probably minimal, because it's when we think, oh, they're going to be so easy to work with and the experience is so difficult, that's when it's pull your hair out frustrating, which a lot of us have experienced in workplaces where we hoped it would be really easy, but then turned out we had a leader who was very difficult, or we were leading someone who was very difficult.
So that's so interesting. And I didn't think of it that way, but you're right. There was a matchup between my expectations and my experience. In fact, maybe my expectation was worse than my experience.
Yeah.
Actually, like I was delighted instead. So interesting though. Okay, so I want to ask you a question because there's a process you cover in your book, which is a 3-step process. This is the part I find interesting about it, that we'll have difficult people step up or step out in 4 weeks. Talk to us about that, because when I was reading that, I was really blown away thinking, wow, you could really vet stuff out fast. This is not a process that needs to take 2 years, which is, I think,
that's right.
You look at it as like, this is a long slog, but 4 weeks.
Yeah, that's right. It's like a 4-week exercise or diet challenge where I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm saying there's going to be some days where you go, oh, why am I doing this? But it does get results. When I first heard this, so this idea of 4 weeks comes from Patrick Lencioni, and he's one of my favorite leadership authors. And I remember I love playing soccer, and I was down in the middle of I was in a leadership role, and as you do, had all these challenges going on as a leader, but one of my outlets was exercise, down at the soccer club. So I remember after one night of soccer training, I was sitting in the car and I just turned on a podcast before I drove home. And I was in the middle of dealing with someone on my team where I really had identified that I knew I needed to have a conversation about culture in their particular team they were leading with me. And so I was sitting there and I was listening to this podcast, not really knowing what to do. And it was just one of those moments where you just feel like someone's talking to you in terms of when they're expressing something. And so Patrick Lencioni was on this podcast, and he was talking about this idea about, if you do this really well, then within 4 weeks, you can see someone that you can see change. And I remember sitting there going, no way. Like, I'd put up with this as a leader for a year. Let's say 2 years. And I didn't know what to do about it. And then he says 4 weeks, and I went, no way. But I love him so much, and his stuff has proven, his content's proven so helpful that I thought, okay, Pat Lencioni, I'll give this a go, but expecting it to fail. And so I went and basically that's the process that I did is what I unpack in the book. This was my first time where I ever actually did it myself, which is why I'm so confident. And I went in very skeptical myself. So I went in and I sat down with this person on my team, and I had this crucial conversation. But the crucial conversation wasn't about their performance. The crucial conversation was about my expectations. And so I sat down with them and I did what I call the self-deprecating apology, which is really, I found for me, it's a great way. When you have these conversations, they're always uncomfortable. So the question is, how do you set the scene in an authentic and vulnerable way to make it as open a discussion as possible? And that's this whole idea of saying, hey, I'm sorry. I don't think I've made the expectations as clear as I could have for you. I've been reflecting on that. And that's something I really want to grow in. And I really want to lead with really clear expectations. And so I just want to have a chat about that. And how are you finding it? Like, do you feel like my expectations are really clear? And this person was actually like, yeah, I had felt like they're pretty clear. But it opened up as my problem I was owning about expectations. And this doesn't always work. Sometimes you have to, it doesn't always work. But if you're in a longer, less urgent situation, that can be a great approach. So I had this conversation, and we talked about a bunch of things. And there's always the element of being on the same page. There's always some common ground. So I was chatting with this leader and we were talking about some things, and of course, tick, tick, tick. But it also gave me the opportunity to clarify in that conversation some of these leading the culture of this team they were leading, and get really clear about that. And of course, the interesting thing is that as I'm doing this, they're nodding and asking questions, and so we talked about the culture of the team, and there was a few things. One thing that stands out is this idea of a culture where you really jump in, and when we're doing stuff across the organization, a sense of teams just jumping in and helping wherever they need to was something that other teams were nailing, and this team that this leader was leading, they weren't. And so I brought that up. Yeah, sure. And another thing that I did out of that is, because you're clarifying expectation in this conversation, I was able to say to this person, look, the other thing is, I want to commit to one thing I want to do as a leader. Is I'm going to commit to, if I see any of this not happening, then I'm going to try to get better at having the courage to actually just bring it up and just mention it. And they were like, sure. And sometimes people balk a bit at that, but it's funny how often leaders have these conversations and they go like it did for me. And so that in and of itself was the easy part. Okay, that was such a breakthrough. So I had this conversation. We articulated these things. I gave them a bit of space to go away and think about it. Then we circled around again and chatted it through. The easy bit. So fast forward a few days, and this is the whole idea of the process, is that once you have ridiculously clear expectations, now it's time to pick small battles. And the idea of step up or step out in 4 weeks is, we're saying step up is to change behavior. Step up is to see someone actually lean in and step up into the behavior and to change for the good, and actually go, I can't believe it. This is now resolved. That's the ideal situation. But the idea of step out is really to say that within 4 weeks, if you pick small battles, 95% of the time, a person, as human beings, we can't handle constantly being held accountable.
Yeah.
And so what we will do is we will change our behavior. We'll go, I can't believe that's 5 times they brought that up. So the next time, guess what? You turn up on time. Or we'll go, this isn't for me, and we'll actually get ourselves out of the situation. And so with this leader, it sounded nice and easy, but then I spotted their team doing, or in one sort of event we were doing, not leaning in, and it's exactly what we clarified. And I went, because that's why the book says, even if you hate conflict, because for me, I come from a really quiet sort of English background family that doesn't. that smiles and nods a little bit. And so for me, it was like, oh no, now I've got to go and have this hard conversation. But the beauty of picking small battles is they're specific. It's a hallway conversation. It's not a big deal. And this leader, he knew that I was going to do this. I had set his expectation up. So what did I do? I went and I grabbed him at a moment where I could, away from people. I said, hey, remember I said I was going to do this? I just noticed that your team, like we talked about your team really, I just noticed that when we've been running this event, your team's really sitting on the sideline. And that's what we talked about. And was that a beautiful moment of camaraderie? No. Was it awkward? Yes. Was it uncomfortable? Yes. But it was small. And there was a bit of pushback. But for the most part, it was like, yeah, okay. And that was the easiest one. They get harder. They do, just to be, like I said, painfully difficult. Possible, remarkably simple, but painfully difficult. And so I reckon I'm going to say there were probably 5 or 6 times where I had small battles. And this happened over, it might have been even a bit more than that, but over 2 or 3 weeks, probably particularly 2 weeks, where I had 5 or 6 of these conversations. And I vividly remember one where I saw something and I went, because I knew if I'm going to do this process, Patrick Lencioni said 4 weeks. I still don't believe it, but okay. So I started walking over there, and I got about halfway there, and I just lost the will to have this conversation. And I turned around and I was like, no, it's too hard. I think I'd already mentioned something that same day. And so I was just like, you know what? No. And then I remembered as I'd given up, I remembered the time I'd had this horrible conversation with someone where it had all blown up, and we'd been sitting there, and they had been like, I could see that I'd just like, they were so hurt, and then afterwards all these other people got hurt, and I was replaying that and going, I am not going to do that again. I'm not going to have one of those horrible nightmare blow up in your face moments. I will not do it. And so I sort of recommitted to it. I turned around and I went and I had the conversation, and it was the worst one. It was because I'd already done it that day. It was like he wasn't keen on it because he was sort of like, why are you bringing this up? So we'd sort of gotten past the nice bit of how we clarified it, but it was specific. It was small. It was only 2 minutes, and it was just me picking another small battle about the same thing, which I'd probably already addressed that particular issue twice. A week later, I get a message to say, oh, can we just catch up? And we end up sitting down, and he said to me, hey, I just really, just because of these different variables, X, Y, or Z, I just have realized that I think for this next season, I'm going to go and actually transition to go and do this. Mm. And I was sitting there, and I actually just couldn't believe it because of that. And I know that it was because of the conversations we'd had. But the beauty of this process and why I'm so passionate about this is that we actually had a friendship, which whenever there's a friendship involved, it makes it 10 times harder. So there was an element of friendship already, and which had made the whole process harder. But because I was so clear about it, and there was no sense of manipulation, there was no sense of me having some horrible intent it was just, gee, Jonno is really awkwardly uncomfortable at bringing these things up with me. We were able to maintain our friendship after that, and he actually stepped out of that role, and we've been able to maintain a really great friendship. And that for me solidified a few things, which was, I can't believe it happened within 4 weeks. It was about 3 weeks. I often tell another story about an organization I worked with where the day after they had the conversation about expectations, someone stepped out. It doesn't always happen like that, but 95% of the time it does happen within 4 weeks. People can't handle those small battles, that accountability. When it's done in a gentle but straightforward way, and the expectations have been made clear, people will change their behavior, or they'll go, actually, you know what, this is worse than having teeth pulled. I'm out. And yeah, 95% of the time, from experience now, I can stand by that, and that's why the book talks about people will step up or step out in 4 weeks.
That blew my mind. Although now that I hear you share the stories, it really does make sense, because you're right. People either change their behavior, or in 4 weeks it becomes very clear that they're not a fit for one reason or another, and it's time to go. And either you get to have that conversation with them because it's been 4 weeks, or they get to have that conversation with you. What I think is really important for us to pay attention to in your stories, Jonno, and in that process, is that we have the leaders have to take accountability for having those small battle conversations over and over and over. That's a hard part. Like, you want to walk away. I have to be willing to move past that thought in my head, which is, I've mentioned this twice. I should not have to say it again, right? But you do. So you have to own the process, which is hard but important. So I know we're almost out of time. So before we go, where can people go to get your book and connect with you?
Yes, well, a couple of things. So you can get it on Amazon as an ebook or as a paperback, the physical book. I'm soon, so in the near future, so possibly by the time this is released, you'll be able to get the audio book on Audible. So check that out. And if it's not up there yet, then sorry, it's coming very soon. The other thing is you can go to my website, which is consultclarity.org, consultclarity.org. And so there's a link there. But the other thing, I really appreciate, Tamara, you having me on. So I'm going to give you a link. The book's normally on Amazon, it's about $20 US. So it's normally around $15, $20 US wherever you can get it. But I'm going to put a link together just because I really want to get this out there for the ebook for $1.70, just for your listeners. So yeah, so I'll just give you that link, and that way anyone who's really identified with that, just as a bit of a thank you for listening and having me on the show, but also just so that it's really accessible, and anyone who's thinking about it, no matter what your setting is, you can just jump on and grab it there. So I'll send you a link to share specifically that has that you can't get anywhere else. So
I love it. Thank you so much. And we'll make sure to put all those links, especially that one, in the show notes and put it front and center. Appreciate that. I want to close out with a question about change and innovation. So oftentimes in the world of innovation or change, it doesn't have to be innovation the way most people think of it as disruptive technology, or not that. I just mean we have to pivot, we have to innovate, right? Think differently about things. People who weren't difficult before become difficult. And, I know that part of that is because they have a fear of being irrelevant. The world is changing around them. What they know is no longer true, or they need to adapt. So there's a lot of personal issues around it. It feels exhausting, right? Now you're asking me to do more work that I've never done before. Like, there's all these reasons. What's your advice for dealing with difficult people who have become difficult because of the shifts and the pivots and the change that you as a team or as an organization have to make? Because they're not 10 minutes late to every meeting. It's kind of situational.
Yes. Yeah. So what comes to mind, I think that's a great question. And what comes to mind is that as leaders, we often subconsciously have one of two goals when we're in that situation. I deal with a lot of leaders that are in that sort of situation, and without ever articulating it until I push them on it, they're going through a big transformation, big change, and they've given themselves the KPI to keep everyone. And I run into leaders who do this, and they've never articulated it until we drill down. But they identify, actually, you know what? I have my goal has really been to have no attrition, to keep everyone on the bus.
And they should all be
there's a flip. Yeah, they should all be happy. How can we do this massive transformation and keep everyone on the bus? And then you get the other leaders who have a different perspective, which is like, from day one, they've already assumed that some of these people, we already assumed they won't make it. And so without articulating it, we actually have a bit of a sense of how do I get them off the bus? And so the starting point, I'd say, it's, as Jim Collins talks about in his book, Good to Great, is I love that analogy of the bus, having people on the bus, is to start by saying, when you're doing big transformation, when you're doing, and you've got people and you're looking at them and they've been left behind, or they're being left behind, or you're worried about them not being able to keep up. The goal isn't to keep everyone. The goal isn't to kick them out. The goal is to, in the healthiest and clearest way possible, to help the right people step on your bus, to keep the right people on the bus, and to help the right people for whom it's now the right time to step off the bus. It's about that process. And I think when you have that perspective as leaders, even communicating that, there's something about when you're pushing into a big transformation, there's something quite freeing about acknowledging that even, and you need to be careful with how you do it, but actually saying, if your organization has to make, because of COVID, some massive, massive changes in the next 12 months, it's about asking yourself, how can I say to my workforce, hey, this is what we have to do. We have to make these big shifts. And I'm just letting you know there's going to be big changes. We have to. If you're a small business, it's about getting a team together and saying, wow, this is where we've been, and we're going to have to do things differently. It's going to be completely different. And give people permission at that point and say, you know what? This is probably going to be really hard for some of us. Some of you, it's going to be a hard season, but you're going to make it through, and we're going to go and do incredible things together. And also, some of you, this might be the season to consider stepping off the bus. And you got to be careful with how you say that. But I think as leaders, sometimes we just need to own that truth. And some of these people, that gives them permission to realize maybe it's time to step off the bus, rather than telling them to their face, you can do it, but deep down we're thinking they'll never come along for the ride. And then when you run that process of transformation and change, you sort of have built permission then to be really clear about expectations and to own the fact that standards are going up, that things are shifting. We're in a time of change. Keep the long-term vision really clear. But I think just sometimes we try to make big change happen, but kind of tell everyone it's not. And so there's an element of actually owning that and going, particularly the small businesses, get your team around you and say, if we're going to survive, wow, things are going to, and then remind them of that message again and again, because at least then their expectation of things are going to have to change. My life, my work role is going to shift. If we try to have their expectation down here, but we know their experience is there, then get the expectation clear on that from the start. That's probably the biggest thing that comes to mind, because particularly a lot of not-for-profits that I've worked with have this fear of attrition. And so when you need to make big changes because of funding or COVID, you need to realize that actually attrition isn't the enemy. The enemy is really poor leadership, where people end up staying on the bus who shouldn't, getting on the bus who shouldn't, or people leaving the bus in a really unhealthy way.
So I feel like that's a great insight to end on. And as someone who is in the business of change and innovation, I like to believe that everybody has the potential, but I also recognize that not everybody should stay on the bus, and that's okay. And that doesn't mean, I do think there are people that you can elevate and help through the difficult times. Like the people on the bus, I want to help. I want to help them elevate. I want to help them get through it, right? To your point, with tough times together. But I also want to leave the door open if anyone's like, I'm out. And that's okay. And so I think that's a really big insight that, hey, particularly when you're dealing with change and innovation, it may mean a little bit of a different team. So, Jonno, that was incredibly insightful. We went a little bit over, but there was so much richness in there. So thank you so much for joining me. We will make sure to put all those links in the show note, but I feel like I got so much out of it. I got to go take some notes.
Well, thank you, Tamara. It's been, I really appreciate you having me on the show. And to all the listeners out there, I just want to encourage you, if we come back to what we said right at the start, invest in people. No matter what you're doing, if you're investing in people, whether it's your clients or you have a team, I really believe that we can change the world. Just those little changes, those little investments in that person, where we help them fulfill their potential, where we get a bit better at conflict. It might seem small, but it makes such a difference in people's lives. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and also for the listeners as well.